Hello, everyone. Welcome. I want to thank everyone for joining us today for Alinea International's webinar, Voices on Climate Action, Where to Turn Up the Volume, des voix pour l'action climatique ou monter le volume. I am very pleased to be here, as is Alinea, to facilitate this conversation as part of Canada's International Development Week. We do want to let all the participants know that there is translation options available in French, and we would invite you to hit the bottom button of your screen if you would like to hear today's webinar translated. Also, a reminder that this session is being recorded. Though we are meeting virtually, I would like to acknowledge that our Alinea office in Calgary resides on Treaty 7 territory, and that Calgary is home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. I would also like to respectfully acknowledge that this webinar is being broadcast across the traditional lands of the Inuit, Indigenous, and Métis nations who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. My name is Jenna Freeman, and I'm a communications specialist at Alinea International. I'm also the communications advisor on Climate Action Africa, which is a project funded by Global Affairs Canada, implemented by Alinea International, as well as Econoler and WSP. So here at Alinea, we are an international development consultancy. Our project teams work as partners to create lasting change by drawing on deep technical knowledge, and we've been doing this for more than 35 years across the world. Biodiversity and climate action are key project pillars of our portfolio, and I'm really thrilled and grateful to be here today as your moderator for this conversation. We do have quite a few people registered, more than 100 to join us today, so I will be doing my very best to keep our panel to time, and we also want to allot for a lot of discussion and questions. So we would invite you to place any questions you may have in the Q&A portion on your screen, and also please identify which panelist the question is directed at, if not all three. I do want to thank everybody participating here today, as well as our panelists, as we look to drive this discussion and address diversity in dialogue around climate change. How do we best create action, not just conversation? So I will start by introducing our panelists, and perhaps I will start with the one joining us from the furthest from our Calgary office, and that is Dr. Yannick Baudouin. And he is the Director of Climate Change and Nature Positive Solutions at Alinea International. Yannick, do you want to say hello or give a wave?
Yep, trying to find the unmute. Bonjour à tous.
In Vancouver, we have Catherine Hill. She is the Gender Advisor for our Climate Action Africa project.
Hello, bonjour.
And finally, we have Marco Heredia, who is a climate diplomacy expert, and he is a consultant for Alinea's Technical Assistance Partnership Project, or TAP project.
Hello, bonjour.
So as everyone on this call is well aware of, we are embarking on this global challenge of learning how to transform climate conversation into action. And what we wanted to talk about today is specifically how to turn up the volume on some of those underrepresented voices in the climate change space. We are fortunate to have three supporting speakers joining us, or contributing to today's webinar. So I will kick things off with a message from Dr. David Suzuki, with perspective emphasizing the importance of Indigenous voices and practices in climate action. Chrissy, can you? I apologize, it appears as though we're having just a couple technical difficulties. We're just working to get the audio from Dr. Suzuki here.
Growth. In 1987, the Brundtland Report was published as Our Common Future and popularized the concept of sustainable development as the solution to our ecological crisis. Now, 45 years later, in the Anthropocene epoch, climate chaos and mass species extinction created by a human population and demand for endless economic growth threaten our own survival. The Brundtland Report pointed out that the only people with a track record of living sustainably in place for thousands of years are the indigenous people. Their traditional knowledge is based on the mistakes, failures, successes, and insights of past generations that imposed a sense of responsibility to act the right way so that nature could continue to flourish and provide people with their necessities. But after 6 centuries of colonization and genocidal policies all over the world, indigenous cultures that are essential to guiding us towards genuine sustainability are on the cusp of extinction. Australian Ranger and Canadian Guardian programs revitalize indigenous cultures with responsibility to monitor the state of nature and guide human activity accordingly. For the sake of all of humanity and the future, we need a global guardians program financed and empowered to lead us into the years ahead.
So Yannick, I'll turn it over to you. What are your thoughts on what we just heard from Dr. Suzuki?
Yes, thank you, Jenna, and bonjour again à tous. I'm just also to recognize that I'm currently calling in from the traditional lands of the Atakai people on the islands of Fiji, where I'm also here looking at ways of bringing in traditional, local, and indigenous knowledge into our climate programming and the work we're doing. And I think building on what Dr. Suzuki just said, you know, this is really an opportunity right now, and an opportunity in many different ways, right? To move beyond tokenism, to move beyond the performative, to really recognize that there are knowledge systems out there that are, you know, been working through adaptation on and resilience building for tens of thousands of years, and they're offering, they're inviting, they're really opening up to relationship, as long as there's relationship and respect, to then say, we need to be able to start looking at different sources of inspiration and imagination. And these knowledge systems are here not to replace something, but really to come together, to merge together, as Elder Albert Marshall says, really to walk with two-eyed seeing. And what does that actually mean, right? So I think we're looking at these issues over the last 30 years of climate change, biodiversity loss, and a lot of this is, and again, it's not to point a finger and say there's one particular knowledge system that's been problematic. It's just that we've been too immersed in it. We've been too blinded by sometimes thinking that there's only one way to do things. There's only one way to know about things. So I think for us, really, there is this opportunity right now to start bridging gaps, you know, weaving together. Our Australian Aboriginal people like to say also yarn together, right? Come into conversation, and so and kind of merge the two, you know, bringing in the Western science, bringing in the voices of indigenous knowledge around the world in different cultures, and then putting that to a certain application, to developing the solutions that don't exist today. So we've been at it for about 30 years, trying with the science, trying with the numbers and the quantities. But so much of the work we need to do is about the qualities that come together, about the real deep culture and deep wisdom that is being offered through invitation and relationship building. So I think, to me, what David is kind of pointing at and saying a Global Guardians program, right? That's a practical, very easy step to sort of take, is sort of to say, what does it look like if we really recognize, truly valued and embraced, and built the relationship with the indigenous people that have been stewarding these lands since time immemorial?
On that note, Yannick, where are we nationally and globally when it comes to equating indigenous ways of knowing in climate action?
I guess in a way it depends on which part of the world you're in. I do want to acknowledge there's just been so much work, genuine work being done on Turtle Island, Inuit Tapariat in Canada. The journey is far from over. It's probably like just beginning, in a way, to not just see and recognize the knowledge, but really come together through, again, invitation and relationship. So I think there are great kind of, you know, North Stars and some lights and some cracks in the wall coming together, but so much more needs to be done. There's still this difficulty in the Western science system to really understand, to really kind of not just like, see it, but really understand it and bring that together. So I think there's glimmers, there's hope, there's a lot of work being done in different parts of the world. You're seeing it in Latin America, you're seeing it in some parts of the Pacific in particular, and also in North America, but it's still these early days, and that challenge of really recognizing the value of this, again, knowledge that dates back since time immemorial.
Thank you very much, Yannick. Let's turn to talk a little bit more about women, a group disproportionately affected by climate change, and at times historically often left out of the conversation. We're going to listen to Dr. Priscilla Achepka, who is the founder of the Women's Environmental Program in Africa.
Having worked extensively in the climate space at the national, community and regional, and also at the global level, my recommendations for people that will really be targeted for these climate actions will be the grassroots women organizations, communities, indigenous people, people with disabilities, because these are the people that are doing incredible work at the grassroots level, and yet their voices are not being amplified at the global level or regional level. So it will be important to target these people and, of course, support them in their actions when it comes to the issues of climate change.
So I touched on it briefly earlier. Climate Action Africa is funded by Global Affairs Canada, and what it does is it responds to demand-driven requests at the local level, providing short-term technical assistance, Canadian technical assistance primarily, to sub-Saharan Africa to help respond to Paris Agreement commitments. So Catherine, can you expand on Priscilla's narrative in your role as a gender advisor on CAA?
Sure, thanks, Jenna. And thank you to Priscilla too, Dr. Achepka. I also wanted to just build on what Yannick was saying too, because I think what we're talking about, it all is very connected, or a yarn by the sounds of it is. So as Dr. Priscilla, or as Dr. Achepka said, it's the grassroots where the impact of climate change is being felt. It's in the communities everywhere in the world. So whether it's in Canada, Africa, Fiji, wherever, we're all feeling that. And it's really where the work of addressing the impacts of climate change is so badly needed. So it's at the grassroots, though, at the community level. And we know that the grassroots is not a homogenous group. There's a lot of people living in different communities. It's where those challenges are perhaps the greatest. While the impact of climate change is in the communities, the decisions that are affecting these communities are made not only within the communities, but outside. So whether that's at district, provincial, national, regional, global levels, there's a lot of complexity in there for the grassroots to try and to grapple with. So this includes what's been really on the sort of the target lately, the global target, is decisions about the kind of action that will be taken or not. It's whether that's in terms of adaptation or mitigation action, or in the transition from fossil fuel economies to economies that are built on clean, affordable, and renewable energy. It's also about the decisions about the loss and damage, and who is going to finance that, and how is that going to be financed. And finally, sort of at the community level, just decisions, as we know, are made within households, they're made within community decision-making structures too. So there's a lot of complexities in there that we have to address. So it's a many-layered, many-tiered area that we want to look at. So as Jenna mentioned, I work with the Climate Action Africa project. And in this role, and as my role also over the last plus 25 years, working with different UN agencies on climate adaptation, on agricultural and natural resources, a lot of sort of issues and questions have come up about the kinds of barriers or constraints that need to be addressed when we're looking at the grassroots and community level in climate action. I can't cover them all, but I would say one of the key things that I've been hearing, especially from groups we've been working with on this project, are the issue of access to information. So for example, in terms of accessing finance or technical assistance mechanism, who has that information and who has access to that information, and how is it shared? What pathways or what avenues are we using to share different information about the kinds of financing and technical assistance that is available? As we know, climate change, like so many different areas, has its climate jargon or climate speak, many acronyms that none of us can keep up with either. So this is something that can be quite a barrier to different groups and at the grassroots. And then in terms of access to decision-making processes and fora, we have to think about mobility, who has transport, who has responsibilities and roles in households and communities. Are there time conflicts within households and communities that sort of stop certain people from participating in the decision-making forums? Who can access funding? That's one thing that we've heard a lot of. Who can access funding to participate in these different fora and processes? And that may be in terms of transport or accommodation, et cetera, et cetera. And then in terms of lack of knowledge or limited knowledge, perhaps in terms of how do we speak in these different processes? There's a whole language and a whole culture really that's built around how we work together on this decision making. So I'll leave it at those sort of 3 points for now. And yeah, thanks.
Well, I'm going to ask you, Catherine, to expand a little bit more on how we better support those organizations, the grassroots groups right now. Is there anything immediately that you think we could be doing better?
So I would have to say, from a sort of review of different areas of looking at the decision-making space, of looking at how we work on projects as development, programming, people, as we work in different sort of spaces, I would have to say, number one, we really need to adopt a human rights approach. And this is coming across all of our programming, but I think this is really key. And it brings in this sort of intersectional approach that we've been talking about in Canada, at least for quite a long time. And it's definitely a broadening issue in terms of understanding that communities, grassroots, they're not homogenous groups. They're made of very different complex dynamics with people who have different identities within themselves. And what does that mean actually for their sort of ability to access these decision-making processes and amplify their voice? So I think that's really key. And I think another thing is strengthening climate leadership. So that means leadership skills, negotiation, advocacy skills of women, Indigenous peoples, youth, you name it. There's so many different groups that we need to look at, but these are really the voices who need to be heard in the processes and often sort of lack or have limited climate leadership skills in that area. I think also in terms of a sort of a broader approach, we need to look at supporting gender responsive and socially inclusive climate awareness, climate literacy, and climate justice education. So we really need to look at how we can sort of broaden out the systemic change that is needed, look at the rules and the regulations that are in place, how the public investments are working, and how do we address those? And it really is building that awareness from the ground up. And I think also the media has a role to play in this, and how can we ensure that the messages that are out there are also looking at gender responsive and socially inclusive means. We also want to look at how we can support organizations, civil society, in terms of participating in these different fora and processes. So as we just experienced, we supported a group to be part of COP27 who was coming from Nigeria and from Western Africa. And I think if we can really support from a programming perspective, broader civil society organizations, I think that's a real contribution. Also, we can work to support more accessible financial and technical assistance mechanisms. So thinking about the processes that we have in place, are they accessible? Does the language make sense? Are there some sort of application forms that are very complicated? As we know, this is something that I've been hearing from a lot of the grassroots organizations that we work with. And finally, I just want to say, I think in terms of strengthening policy and programming at all levels, I just want to talk about the need for data and evidence, and that's something that's crucial both in terms of looking at scientific knowledge and local knowledge. One of the things I just wanted to know was the nationally determined contributions, which lay out how countries are going to address their climate change. I thought there was a really interesting study. It was a 2022 study of the country's nationally determined contributions. It was undertaken by the Disability Inclusive Climate Action Research Program, DICARP, out of Montreal, McGill, and they found that only 35 out of 192 state parties referred to persons with disabilities in their NDC. So we have a long way to go. I could talk about all the different groups, but I'm going to leave it there for now. So I hope those are some tangible steps that will help us move forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. So another expert deployment mechanism and global affairs funded project that Alinea is implementing is the Technical Assistance Partnership Initiative, or TAP, and it responds to needs identified by countries eligible for international assistance, and it pairs those requests with Canadian expertise, which includes work on climate action. So recently, our panelist, Dr. Marco Heredia, supported the Maldivian delegation at COP27. We're now going to listen to a short clip from Her Excellency Miss Khadija Nassim. She's the Minister of State for Environment, Climate Change and Technology of the Maldives.
The Maldives is one of the most vulnerable countries to the impacts of climate change. We have only 83 months until 2030 to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. This is why we try our best to take a leadership role in the international climate negotiations because of our vulnerabilities, and to also collectively represent the voice of SIDS. And we want to focus on increasing the ambition on mitigation, adaptation, address loss and damage, and also to advocate for increasing finance flows to address the urgent needs for vulnerable countries like the Maldives. But our capacities are limited, and we have very small negotiation teams to represent us meaningfully in the international negotiations. As you would all know, the international negotiation space is heavily complex, very technical, and requires attention to detail. And we also want to focus on training more youth and more women, because we think that representation matters in these spaces, and the voices really matter in the decisions that are taken at the international level that will have local impacts. This is why the Climate Diplomacy Initiative is so important for us. Through this project, we will have a curriculum produced that can train future negotiators to better engage in negotiations. And I'm certain that this initiative from TAP EDM team will help us better support our country's positions on international platforms and strongly advocate for climate vulnerable countries like the Maldives. Thank you.
So Marco, maybe you can expand on what Minister Nassim said about the complexities of navigating a space like COP27 for some of these smaller nations most affected by climate change, and the technicalities involved, and also some gender equality they might confront as well. Inequality, I should say.
Thank you very much, Jenna, and good day, everyone. I'm pleased to greet you and participate today from Montreal, a land that has long served as a meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous people, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. Bonjour à toutes et tous. Je suis heureux de vous saluer et participer aujourd'hui de Montréal sur un emplacement qui a longtemps servi de lieu de rencontre et d'échange entre les peuples autochtones, y compris les nations Haudenosaunee et Anishinaabe. Climate change, as you all know, and we're here for that, to talk about that, is one of the greatest challenges facing humanity today. In the case of the Maldives, that challenge is practically an existential one. When we talk about the Maldives, we're talking about more than 1,200 scattered islands across the Indian Ocean. 80% of those islands have an elevation of around 1.5 meters. So we're talking really about a country whose existence is practically a risk should climate action fail. This is a situation shared by other island states and countries that have a low elevation. In these territories, the rise of the sea level, waves, and ocean flooding put people and their assets, their homes, their lives at risk. Moreover, the Maldives' contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions is 0.003% of the global emission rate. So the government of the Maldives has requested support from Canada through the Technical Assistance Program and the deployment of Canadian experts. As part of this effort, Alinea International has developed a project in conjunction with the government of the Maldives and with the accompaniment of diplomatic representations to identify how best to support that government to increase its presence, effectiveness, and the expected results of this cadre of negotiations and negotiators in the context of the COPs, the Conference of the Parties, and other high-profile meetings in the context of the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. This project also seeks to ensure the presence of women and young people in the complex and very dynamic negotiations that take place in this important but also technically complex scenario. In the execution of this project, we accompanied the Maldivian delegation to COP27, the most recent climate event held in the city of Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, where more than 35,000 people came together to review progress and identify ways to move forward. My participation there as an expert negotiation focused on accompanying, advising, and providing technical information so the Maldivian negotiators had support, accompaniment, coaching, mentoring, and their voice was heard and had an impact on the negotiations. Today, we're talking about this event is Voices for Climate Action. We're talking about that today. These island states like the Maldives do not have 100 or 80 or 90 negotiators, as other countries or group of countries do. This team of women and young people are 5 negotiators who proudly represent their country and seek to make their voices heard. The voice of people who stand to lose their homes to effective climate action. Canada is helping those voices to prepare, plan, coordinate, and improve their ability to understand the structures, processes, interests, and challenges of this complex negotiation environment so that the world will look at their critical situation and hear their voices. I want to tell you that Alinea is up to the task and up to its commitment to improve and foster development, and we're fulfilling it to the fullest. My presence there was assured, and I had the possibility to support and coach Maldives delegates, underscoring the latest science and policy advances on mitigation and adaptation. Although the negotiations were not easy, oftentimes during the day, we ended up after midnight, but the negotiators had the necessary support proposed by and delivered by Canada, as this important initiative was meant to be in that way. So here we're looking at an initiative that builds sustainable capacity in the future negotiation processes, engaging organizations and training centers from the Maldives. That's what we're doing here.
Thank you, Marco. Finally, can you maybe speak to the magnitude of climate action when it comes to a population like the Maldives, for those that maybe can't quite grasp the existential threat from, for instance, a population like Canada?
Yes. Well, although we are implementing this project, this climate diplomacy project, 13,000 kilometers away, in appearance, that's far. But we're supporting a country that's very different, and we're supporting a country that's very different from ours. However, I want to tell you that these differences unite us. The Maldives, Canada, communities around the world in general have a greater degree of vulnerability as temperatures rise, sea levels rise, and the climate anomalies become more severe and less predictable. So the communities in the Maldives and the reef ecosystems of that beautiful place are no less threatened than the Inuit communities in the Canadian Arctic or other vulnerable communities and ecosystems in coastal zones in Canada. For them, for the Maldives, as very much for us in Canada, every fraction of a degree is important. Every ton of GHGs count. And we must remember then, when we're faced with floods, wildfire, or hurricanes, we are like the ones that hit recently the Maritimes. We have to think about how do we help the developing world, but how also we support our own country trying to adapt to a changing climate. So our Canadian climate is irreversibly changing, and we're already witnessing and experiencing significant climate change impacts. So this is important to bring at this point in time. Our climate is changing and will continue to warm rapidly. In Canada, for example, at a rate that's 2 times faster than the global average. And in some parts of the Arctic, it's even 3 times faster. So we have to remember that. We're home to the longest coastline in the world, covering more than 240,000 kilometers and spanning across 3 oceans and interior lakes. For us, it's a no-brainer. I mean, we have to adapt to climate change. We have to do whatever it's on our end to deal with that. And we have to protect our ecosystems, our communities, from the vulnerability, the exposure, and building capacity on those areas. So in both the tropical reefs and the Maldives and the Arctic, differences of 3, 4, 5 degrees in temperature can mean the difference between life or death of species and irreparable and irreversible effects on the habitat. In agriculture, the agri-food sector, farmers are already experiencing the devastation of increased drought, floods, and wildfires. This affects the long-term economic viability of the sector and this community. So I would like to underscore that in climate change, in developed and in developing countries, women, elders, young people, and some of the most vulnerable groups are at risk, at a very high risk. So I would just like to give some information about, for example, of the 619 people who died in the June 2021 heat dome in British Columbia. 16% of those were over 70 years old. 56% of them lived alone, and 61% were located in low-income neighborhoods. So whatever we do elsewhere, we have to do it here. Whatever we are in terms, we're implementing in terms of adaptation, we also can and have to learn about it. So it's all about adaptation, but it's all about mitigation as well, and all the opportunities, the synergies, and the challenges that this represents for us in terms of innovation, infrastructure, and research. We have to go for that. We have to go for green jobs. We have to go for prosperity. Let's not forget that Sustainable Development Goals. Today, we're talking in the goal for the goals. We have to go for that, and we have to leave no one behind. So I'd like to underscore, finally, that the Technical Assistance Program funded by Global Affairs Canada and implemented by Alinea International is grounded also on the Feminist International Assistance Policy. And in line with that, we're making strides to deliver objective and tangible results in terms of addressing the root causes of vulnerability, which many times begins with the exclusion of women from the decision-making processes. So thank you for that, and I hope that answers your question, Jenna.
Thank you so much, Marco, and thank you to all our panelists today for your input for today's webinar. Before we get to the Q&A portion, I do want to open it up for any final thoughts. As I promised, I'm going to be taking you to task in terms of sticking to time. So I would ask that you be brief, if possible, in your closing remarks. And Yannick, I'll turn it over to you first.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you. And I'll just continue and build a little bit from what Marco mentioned, but also building on some of Catherine's pieces. And just by sharing, I'm here currently working for Alinea in Fiji, where we're exploring the different needs, the different communities, what's been going on, what's missing, what are the gaps, and all the climate programming is just so much of it. What I found fascinating when Marco was talking about the Maldives and potential relocation, right? This is happening already here, right? They're relocating communities now. They have compensation pieces for in play for all kinds of climate events. And what I found, what struck me the most is it's normal almost. Like the World Bank will be here. It's normal. We'll pay and we'll move the people. We'll have a national strategy on moving people. We'll have, it struck me as we've normalized it already, right? And I don't quite know yet what that means, but to me, it's just uncomfortable. It means we've kind of systemized and absorbed this idea without, by abstracting people, basically, by abstracting especially the most vulnerable groups. And so this is not a Fijian issue, it's just an example of what I've been brought to here. And so it's happening in many parts of the world. But also what struck me when I was down in Australia not so long ago was people asking me, hey, like, wow, yeah, Canada, climate change. You guys are like, yeah, we heard about the fire in British Columbia, the Lytton, BC. Wow, a lot of climate change going on in Canada. And it's like, it felt more real coming from the outside than what we're sometimes hearing internally, also with our messaging and the media and the storytelling, making it, these are events that are now going to become normal as well for us. Like we have to start figuring out why we're accepting this. And so I think there's an element too that's needed around disruption, right? We have these processes, we have these strategies, this planning, ongoing, repeat. as opposed to disrupting the process, disrupting the negotiation styles, disrupting these pieces. So there's something around disruption that also needs to probably start happening. Otherwise, we're just going to normalize everything about it.
Thank you, Yannick. I'll turn it over to you, Catherine.
Thanks very much. Just building again on what Yannick was talking about. And yeah, so I think importantly, I wanted to say from all of my experience, the need for longer term commitment is really, really clear. When we're talking about issues of climate adaptation, it's something that we really need to consider when we're talking about agricultural cycles and seasons and that. Often things don't work in a first season. How do we build a sort of a longer term commitment, whether that's financial, whether it's programming, whatever that is. So I think that's really key to keep in process or to keep in sight for us. And also coming back to, again, I think a really critical thing is we're talking about amplifying voices. How do we as development organizations ensure that those voices are included in the decision-making processes? So what can we do within our own programming, within our own organizations, within designing our own programs and carrying them out to see how we can actually see what are the different voices there? Are we getting people with disabilities voices into the different decision-making for our Indigenous people's voices being heard? Youth voices, finally, there was a youth pavilion this year at the COP27. So I think, you know, if we start to think more about who are the different voices we want to amplify and how do we, you know, hand over that power and say, go for it, you know, and amplify the voices. We need to provide the space in some ways and let those voices talk, because as Yannick has pointed out, we really can build on a lot of the existing knowledge that has kept people going for thousands and thousands of years that we have just ignored for so long. So I think it's really, really key that we sort of bring those different perspectives in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine. And finally, Marco, your thoughts.
There's a number of challenges ahead, but I believe that we have to get ourselves very well organized, be mindful. I concur totally with Yannick and with Catherine in terms of disruption, in terms of changing patterns, in terms of changing behaviors, but also I'd like to mention that communities and Indigenous people, they've been in this planet for a long time. They know how to do this. We can learn a lot from them, and we can share their thoughts, share their vision, share their patterns, their conducts in terms of respect, in terms of consumption, in terms of production. So it is all about looking at the way we're doing things and how we can be more efficient in the way that we live our lives and organize ourselves, and we become more resilient to these climate anomalies. We will have this climate anomalies for this century. So how do we best organize ourselves? How do we best prepare ourselves? And how do we best deliver for those who are coming just behind us in terms of the future generations? I believe we know at this point we have, there's never been so much knowledge about climate change mitigation. There's never been so much knowledge and support for adaptation. Well, let's use that. Let's take advantage of that, and let's be serious about it. I believe communities, Indigenous people, this most vulnerable groups only deserve that, and we also deserve and have to give ourselves the opportunity to go in a disruptive manner to do more for what we have for this planet and for the generations to come. Right now, we're supporting a country, like I said a minute ago, but we're supporting ourselves in doing this, in learning this, and get our heads around the way we can do better and do more with less. So those would be my thoughts at this point in time, Shanna.
Thank you, Marco. So I'll turn now to the Q&A portion of today's webinar. And again, just a reminder, if you do have questions, please place them in the Q&A portion of the screen. And if it's directed at a certain panelist, please indicate so. So our first question is anonymous, and it is, how can localization support to effectively deliver development results in Latin America and Africa for gender-based approach and nature-based solutions? So perhaps, Yannick, I'll start with you when it comes to this question, as there's no clear panel list identified to answer it. Perhaps we can all take a stab at it.
Yeah, thank you, and great question. Thanks for that. I think it's also, I start down with the word localization. I find it can be a bit challenging. It sounds like we're an external force is acting again on a local force. So maybe more locally led, right? Locally designed, locally led. And from my perspective, and I've been, my background is UN as well, and a long time of working in that kind of very stagnant system that changes incrementally. Looking at things differently, right? What does it mean to seed space, right? Alinea as a company, one of the biggest abilities and privileges we have is we can work with donors and secure money. Money's great, fantastic. Now, if we decide what to do with that money at the local level, there's a problem. But if we seed space, if we create the environment and step out of it, this is where you can get that locally led innovation. You can get the locally led designs. Like Marco was a bit saying, the solutions are already there, right? They're just not being heard or listened to, because oftentimes we come in with, the global north will save the global south, the still approach. I think what's been fascinating over the months that I've now joined Alinea is, it's not the mentality we're approaching this at. Really, the power is local. The solutions are local. The innovation, the ideas, the things that will be legacy will be local. So how do you build up the community organizations, right? Who may be so organized and yet don't quite meet the standards of an international donor? What can we do as an organization to build that capacity up as you're delivering perhaps a nature-based solution or a gender piece? So I think that to me is where that locally led innovation piece, and how can we as a Canadian company help amplify, accelerate, and seed space and share our privilege. I think that is something where we can see a lot of the breakthroughs coming forward.
Thank you, Yannick. Catherine?
Thanks very much. Yeah, I think Yannick covered a lot of probably what I wanted to say, but I wanted to add also, from the over 25 years again of working primarily with the UN system, but also with NGOs and just the different donor, fora that we work within too. But it's the whole area too of, looking at, like you said, Yannick, locally led, right? And so who is determining the results, right? We're so focused on results-based management always. Who is determining the vision? Who is determining what is needed, what is wanted at the ground? And there's obviously going to be different priorities too. And I think that's a really key point where we're thinking even about adaptation options. Within a community, women and men, different groups within a community may have different needs and different constraints about what kind of adaptation options they need. And I think sometimes it becomes sort of a blanket cover for everybody that this adaptation option is going to work for you, or this mitigation option is going to work for you. So, again, considering what are those local voices, and what are the different local voices within a community, and how do we ensure that those voices are included? And then I think also when talking about results, I think also it's upon us as donors, as development organizations, to think about the process. Sometimes I think the process gets lost in how we design projects. There's always this sort of funding cycles and things that we have to be cognizant of. But how do we ensure that those voices are in the process right at the beginning? So I don't know. It's a systemic change, maybe I'm looking for, but it's a challenging one that obviously has been a thread throughout my UN career and beyond. So thank you.
And Marco.
Thank you very much. Well, I would concur with both visions again. I believe that for many years the climate change discussion globally was centered about mitigation. And 10, 11 years ago, the discussion, the need to address adaptation, the need to address communities and local perspectives was really gained momentum. So I guess we're at a point where I was discussing a minute ago we already know what is to be done. We just need to make the necessary changes to our processes, to our dynamics, to our inertias, so that we do not discuss from a high, altitude kind of discussion, but we bring the issues to the ground. We bring the issues to the table. We bring the issues to seek solutions in black and white. I was thinking when I was hearing Catherine about this need for opening spaces, and this is something that Yannick also mentioned. How do we ensure that we have the tools, the mechanisms, but also the windows for hearing those voices? And let me tell you, I'm working also on a project with Alinea and TAP EDM to develop a system of information to better understand the gender and environment nexus. And what I can tell you from the information I've reviewed and the ecosystem of information, that it's not particular to the context where we're working, but it's also shared across the board in terms of the lack of information of those interventions that really need to be tailored to address the difference between men and women. That is just something that's not visible. And we have to make that visible. We have to have the information to make better solutions. So what I can tell you at this point in time is when there are gaps around how public policy is helping address those gaps, we have to look at the ways we're doing things, and we don't have to think in an inertia of the way we've been doing things for a number of years. We really have to set our minds around how can we best inform solutions to public problems where we are part of those problems, where we need to make more visible the differences, the gaps, the opportunities to contribute to public solutions. So what I can tell you is we're in that process. We're doing that with the best of our knowledge and abilities to map, to outline, and to underscore the need for a more responsive, in this case, gender, but it can be in many other areas, more effective policy. And that's something we're in the process of doing. Thanks.
Thank you, Marco. I'll go to our second question, and just a nice reminder, we want to get to as many questions as we possibly can. So brevity in mind when we're responding. This will be directed at all three panelists again. One of the critics of international development and environmental programs is that sometimes they reinforce colonial narratives. In your experience at Alinea, how do you tackle this challenge? Again, I recognize these are not simple questions to answer, but in a short period of time, but please do your best. Catherine, I'll start with you.
Thanks very much. I think a lot has already been probably said that would answer that in the way that we're talking about looking towards locally led solutions, that those solutions are already there. So how can we create that space within our own projects, no matter what the perimeters are that we have in terms of how the project has been designed? How can we then take that energy forward to be able to create that space for locally led ideas? And again, I get what Yannick is saying too. We're talking about, that whole idea of locally led. We're saying that it's locally led instead of asking really what the voices are in the field, that, what do they want? What is locally led to them? So I think it's basically about creating the space in whatever programs we're working with and whatever stage we're at, whether it's design, whether it's implementation or beyond. So it's too complex a problem to sort of speak about very quickly, but I think those are some sort of key things that I would take away.
Thank you, Catherine. I appreciate it. Marco?
Well, yeah, there's a number of opportunities here. I would refer to the fact that working with the governments, I mean, the work with in which top EDM is working is at the instance of the governments and at the instance of those problems that are identified on the ground. The case of the Maldives is a very, government fostered or impulsed project, but it does speak about the need to enhance their voice, to be more proactive, effective, and responsive to those needs I was referring earlier on. In the case of the El Salvador project, this is also something that will contribute to their own mechanisms to address socio-environmental problems. So I guess that here we are being respectful and mindful of local priorities, and I can tell you, that's the beauty of TAP EDM, that it does work with the local governments, with the local with local perspectives about issues where they see fit for Canada's support in this overall exchange and overall cooperation implementation.
Yannick?
Awesome, thanks. And I'll just build on that, but mirror it back. I think there's also an opportunity in our space to help provide the feedback back to the donor system itself, right? There's a lot of great conversations. I commend our Global Affairs Canada colleagues when we meet and have discussions around climate and nature-based solutions and development. There is an openness and a desire to say, well, how do we improve? And I think there's an ability then to say, we can, with permission, we can be a voice back, right, from the local all the way back to donor, to say, well, when you set up something and a criteria like this, it's pretty colonial. How do we decolonize that as well over time? So that incremental, you don't want to suddenly rock everything at the same time. It can be politically challenging, but I think it's been nice to see that we have a capacity as a bit of a non-advocacy, apolitical organization to just say, hey, this is what we heard down here. What do you think if there was a bit of that next time? And I think that's on us as well as practitioners, not just as Alinea, but any NGO, UN agency, give that feedback as well back to the donor system to sort of say, we need to decolonize the money. We need to shift that power as well. And what are the steps, concrete steps that can be taken? And for the most part, this is welcomed in the donor side. They want that feedback as well. So, yeah.
Thank you, Yannick. We'll go to a question now from Zainab Mansoure. I apologize if I've mispronounced that. They ask, how about recruiting youth to Canada educational training skills on climate change issues, rather than pouring money to African politicians? Perhaps Yannick, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, it's always a bit of a challenge to sort of see what a concrete solution can be in 30 seconds. I think for me, the youth piece is really key in the sense of, so far, this is my personal feelings, being at 10, 12 COPs over the years, it's still a very tokenistic, performative piece, building up youth power in decision making for the future. So intergenerational negotiating in a way for climate is probably one of those disruptive things that we sort of need. I was recently asked by a climate ambassador, what would I do to disrupt the COP? What a fascinating question. And it's like, to me, was that intergenerational element. So yes, part of it comes with programs of building up youth voice. Again, I'm an older guy. I'm not going to be able to teach youth how to be youth. So it's more about, how can I provide the space and the resources for youth to build themselves up as well in different ways, right? Youth and climate diplomacy is different from youth and activism. What does that look like, right? How do we provide that? So you're right. Sometimes there's the challenges you're trying in international development. Part of it is the support and the aid, trying to go from one country to the other. The other is intentionalities can be mixed, right? There's political reasons why governments do work in collaboration, and it's not always easy to sort of move one flow to another. But I feel if there was that agenda, there is on the Canadian context, there's a lot of support in the climate change space from Global Affairs to youth groups. Also domestically in Canada, a lot of youth councils, even the Prime Minister's Youth Council, for example. I think modeling that and again, moving beyond the tokenism into real power. And what does that look like? And I do not have the answer for that. But I think if we can start with that, then we may start to move and disrupt the current processes.
Thanks, Yannick. I'm going to move to the next question, which is similar from Bailey Taylor, and maybe I'll get Marco and Catherine to weigh on this one. And it's, how can youth be best engaged in climate action and conservation?
Want to go first, Catherine?
Sure, I can do that. Yeah. I don't know if it's up to me to sort of describe how youth, can or cannot be engaged. I think what we're talking about here is trying to understand who those voices are. So I think the first thing is really to understand, what do youth want? And youth is not going to be one homogenous group again, whether it's in Canada, whether it's in Africa or wherever else. So one thing that we are doing in Climate Action Africa is trying to support knowledge sharing experiences. And we're very, very interested in working with youth too, to understand, what are those issues that they want to bring to the table, whatever table that may be, if it's their own community table, or whether it's a sort of provincial or a global table. So I think it really is, again, coming back to, how do we create that space? How do we, if we have the resources within different projects, and that, how can we support youth to come together and decide what is important to them? They're the ones who are inheriting the planet beyond us, right? So yeah, I think it's up to them to really define how and what they want to move forward with. They've got lots of great ideas, I have to say. Thanks.
And on that, we'll add to that civil society plays a key role in this. I mean, maybe I'll refer to the previous question. I would just say that we're not talking about the same capacities. We're not talking about the same, social fabric and texture that's there. In a country such as Canada, we have the civil society that supports, that gets informed, that moves ahead, that is critical and questions and exercises rights. And this is not similar in other parts of the world. So we have to acknowledge the fact that Canada has a number of, and it's built upon liberty, freedom, and human rights, and we do not have to miss that. We cannot give or take that for granted. I believe that in many places there's no opportunities, there's no even the ability for women to speak their mind. So let's not forget about that. I mean, the liberty, the freedom that we have here in Canada is not shared. I mean, hopefully it would be like that, but it is not. And I was mentioning on the capacity of some delegations to deploy 100 people to these events, to cover every single base, to have experts here and there. But you're talking about really different capacities, different structures, different budgets. I mean, let's not forget that. And I believe that these projects, as questionable as they may be, they make a difference. And what I can appreciate and tell you from my own experience is that this makes a difference.
Thank you, Marco. So in the interest of time, I have one more question, and we'll do a rapid response to each of our panelists. And it is, where would you like to see the conversation and action on climate change a year from now in 2024? Again, I appreciate this is not as easy as it sounds to answer in 30 seconds, but please do your best. Catherine, I'll start with you.
I know there's been a lot of talk over 27 COPs, and we keep saying we're going to move to action. So yeah, moving to action rather than, I mean, obviously conversation is important. And then moving more towards the just transition to renewable, affordable, and clean energy. Thanks.
Marco?
Oh, I would think that, yeah, I would concur. I mean, we need more action and less conversation. We need more mobilization of finance. But we need to know where and why, and this is something that's also that needs to be built from the bottom up. This cannot be other way. There's no other way or other effective way to do it, and this entails participation of society, of young people, of women, of vulnerable groups. And this entails the participation of civil society, the financing system, the finance system, and obviously governments, municipal, provincial, and federal. Yep.
Thanks, Marco. Yannick?
Yeah, I'd like to see the start of the conversation to reboot and redesign the COP process itself. As a social process person background, I think there's a lot of space for innovation now in the process piece and all that. So there you go, 2024, the new COP.